Maxwell Grant, a 52-year-old tech billionaire, returns from a global conference to find his fragile 75-year-old mother, Catherine, collapsed in the snow outside his Manhattan estate, supported by Jamal Robinson, a 16-year-old homeless black teen. The sight triggers both gratitude and suspicion in Maxwell as he rushes toward them, unaware that this chance encounter will not only expose the racial prejudices he never acknowledged, but ultimately cost him everything he built over 30 years. His heart pounds against his custom suit as his Italian leather shoes crush through the fresh snow, his mind racing with questions about why this stranger is touching his mother. Catherine looks up with relief in her tired eyes, clutching the boy's worn jacket as if it were a lifeline, while the teen meets Maxwell's approaching figure with dignity despite his tattered clothes and the visible tremor of cold in his thin frame. Maxwell quickens his pace, his wealth and power suddenly meaningless as he realizes how close he came to losing the only person who ever truly loved him, not knowing that this moment will become the pivot upon which his entire life will turn, forever altering the empire he built and the man he believed himself to be. The winter air bit through Maxwell's cashmere coat as he reached Catherine and the young man supporting her frail body in the gathering darkness. "Mother, what happened?" Maxwell demanded, his voice sharper than intended as his security team emerged from the building behind him, hands instinctively moving toward concealed weapons at the sight of Jamal. Catherine's voice trembled not from cold but from indignation as she explained, "This young man saved me, Maxwell. I got confused after my medication and walked outside without Greta noticing. I fell in the snow and couldn't get up. This kind soul helped me when everyone else just passed by." Maxwell studied Jamal's face, searching for ulterior motives, but finding only exhaustion and quiet dignity. "Sir, she was barefoot in the snow," Jamal explained quietly, his voice educated and clear despite his circumstances. "I was just trying to help her back inside." The security team had formed a semicircle around them, their postures openly hostile. "Step away from Mrs. Grant," the head of security ordered, his hand firmly on Jamal's shoulder. Catherine's voice rose with unexpected strength. "You will unhand him this instant, Robert. This boy saved my life while you were all inside." The security guard reluctantly backed away as Maxwell, torn between ingrained suspicion and his mother's distress, made a quick decision. "Come inside, both of you. Mother needs to warm up immediately." The group moved toward the private elevator that would take them to Maxwell's penthouse, occupying the top 3 floors of the building. Inside the elevator, the stark contrast between Maxwell's world and Jamal's became painfully apparent. The teen stood awkwardly in his threadbare clothes, careful not to touch the polished walls or mirror surfaces, while Maxwell supported his mother. The elevator opened directly into a vast living area with floor-to-ceiling windows, showcasing the glittering Manhattan skyline, priceless art adorning walls that had been featured in architectural magazines, and furniture whose designers would be recognized only by the extremely wealthy. Catherine was settled onto a plush sofa by the waiting house staff as a doctor was called. Maxwell turned his attention to Jamal, who stood uncertainly near the elevator. "Thank you for helping my mother," he said stiffly, professional politeness masking his discomfort. "Can I offer you something hot to drink?" The question seemed to surprise both of them. As a staff member brought tea, Maxwell began questioning Jamal about his background, his tone somewhere between interrogation and conversation. Jamal explained he had lost his family in an apartment fire 6 months ago. "The system placed me in temporary foster care, but once I turned 16, placements became harder to find. I aged out of my last placement 2 months ago." His voice contained no self-pity, only a matter-of-fact recounting of circumstances that made Maxwell shift uncomfortably in his Italian leather chair. "What about school?" Maxwell asked. "I was in advanced placement before everything happened. I try to keep up with studies at the library when it's open." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Harrison Phillips, Maxwell's business partner of 20 years. Harrison strode confidently into the penthouse without knocking, his presence familiar in this space. He stopped abruptly at the sight of Jamal, his expression changing from surprise to thinly veiled disgust. "Max, a word?" he said, not acknowledging Jamal at all. Maxwell excused himself and followed Harrison to his home office. What the hell are you thinking having that kind of person in your home? Harrison hissed once the door closed. Did security check him for weapons? For drugs? You know these street kids are usually trouble. Maxwell felt a flicker of defensiveness. He helped my mother when she was in danger. I'm just thanking him before sending him on his way. Harrison shook his head. This is exactly the kind of bleeding heart nonsense that causes problems. Give him $20 and get him out before something goes missing. The two men emerged from the office to find Catherine sitting upright. Color returned to her cheeks, engaged in animated conversation with Jamal. "Harrison," she called, waving him over. "Come meet this remarkable young man who helped me today." Harrison's face formed a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "How fortunate you were there," he said to Jamal, his tone suggesting anything but genuine gratitude. Catherine continued. "Jamal was telling me about his interest in engineering. Did you know he built a working solar charging station for his community center before the fire took his home?" Harrison made a non-committal sound before turning to Maxwell. "We should discuss the Singapore merger before tomorrow's call." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. "Surely business can wait until we've properly thanked this young man? Perhaps Maxwell could offer him that position in building maintenance that opened last week?" Maxwell began to decline automatically, but Harrison interrupted. "With all due respect, Catherine, we need someone with experience and references for that role. Security considerations, you understand." Catherine's normally gentle voice took on a steel edge that shocked Maxwell. "I understand perfectly, Harrison. I understand you're suggesting this young man who stopped to help an elderly woman when everyone else walked by is somehow less trustworthy than the people you typically hire. I wonder what specific security considerations you're referring to." The room fell silent as Harrison's face flushed red. Maxwell stood frozen, caught between his mother's unexpected challenge and his partner's obvious anger. In that moment, looking between his mother's determined expression and Harrison's barely concealed contempt, Maxwell made a decision that would set in motion consequences he couldn't begin to imagine. "Actually, we could use someone in the Monroe building. The position includes a small studio in the staff quarters." Harrison's look of betrayal was matched only by the surprise on Jamal's face and the satisfied nod from Catherine. Maxwell had never defied Harrison's judgment in matters of personnel, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time in years, Maxwell felt uncertain in his own home, having chosen his mother's wishes over his partner's demands, watching as the carefully separated worlds he maintained began to collide in ways he never anticipated. 3 days later, Jamal reported for his first day of work at the Monroe Building, a luxury apartment complex owned by Grant Technologies in the Upper East Side. The head of maintenance issued him uniforms without meeting his eyes and directed him to the building manager, Richard Keller. Richard was a thin man with perpetually pursed lips and eyes that seemed to calculate costs with every glance. "You're the charity case," he said by way of greeting, looking over Jamal's paperwork with obvious disdain. "Let's get something straight right away. You're here because the boss's mother has a soft spot for strays, but one slip-up and you're back on the street. Clear?" Jamal nodded, his expression carefully neutral despite the insult. Richard assigned him to clean all 26 floors of stairwells, a task usually rotated among 3 maintenance workers. "When you finish that, report back for your next assignment. The small studio in 1B is yours, but remember it's conditional on your employment." The following days established a pattern. Richard would assign Jamal the most difficult and demeaning tasks, from unclogging residents' toilets to scrubbing graffiti from the service entrance, often keeping him working hours past his scheduled shift. Other staff members took their cue from Richard, either ignoring Jamal completely or watching him with suspicious eyes, always quick to check areas where he had worked as if expecting to find something missing. Meanwhile, Catherine had begun visiting Maxwell's office more frequently, often arriving early enough to encounter Jamal during his morning duties. Unlike the other residents who looked past him as if he were invisible, Catherine always greeted him warmly, sometimes bringing him coffee or sitting with him during his brief breaks in the staff room. During these conversations, Catherine shared stories of her own childhood in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, Her late husband struggled to establish his first business, People Lice, and the early years when Maxwell was a curious boy, more interested in taking apart electronics than in the privileges his father's growing success provided. Maxwell wasn't always surrounded by wealth and yes-men, she told Jamal one morning. His father and I raised him to understand the value of hard work and treating people with dignity. Somewhere along the way, especially after Robert died, he started to lose sight of that. One Tuesday afternoon, Maxwell arrived unexpectedly to check on a renovation project in one of the penthouse units. Walking through the service corridors, he came upon Jamal sitting on an overturned bucket during his break, intensely focused on what appeared to be an advanced mathematics textbook. Jamal quickly stood when he noticed Maxwell, closing the book and preparing to return to work. "What are you reading?" Maxwell asked, genuinely curious. Jamal hesitated before showing him the differential equations text. "I found it discarded in one of the apartments being cleaned out. The resident said I could have it." Maxwell studied Jamal more carefully. "You understand this material?" Jamal nodded. "I was taking early college mathematics before I had to drop out. I'm trying to keep up so maybe someday I can go back to school." Something in the boy's determined expression reminded Maxwell of himself at a younger age, staying up late to teach himself programming languages, driven by a hunger to understand and create. Before Maxwell could respond, Richard appeared in the corridor. "Robinson, break's been over for 3 minutes. The garbage compactor is jammed again." He noticed Maxwell and immediately straightened. "Mr. Grant, I didn't know you were visiting today. Is there anything you need?" Maxwell shook his head. "Just checking on the Henderson renovation. Carry on." He walked away, but found himself thinking about Jamal's circumstances throughout his meetings that day. 2 weeks later, Maxwell received an urgent call from building security. Richard Keller had accused Jamal of stealing jewelry from an apartment he had accessed to fix a leaking pipe. The security footage showed Jamal entering and leaving within the time frame of the reported theft. Maxwell arrived to find Jamal sitting in the security office, facing Richard's accusations with quiet dignity despite the gravity of the situation. "I didn't take anything, Mr. Grant," Jamal said, meeting Maxwell's eyes directly. "I fixed the pipe under the kitchen sink and left immediately." Maxwell instructed security to review all footage from that floor. 3 hours later, the expanded search revealed something unexpected. The night before, Richard himself had entered the apartment using a master key, stayed for 4 minutes, and left carrying something small that he placed in his pocket. When confronted with this evidence, Richard claimed he was performing a routine inspection, but further investigation of his office revealed the missing jewelry hidden in his desk, along with several other items reported missing over the past month. Maxwell immediately fired Richard but instructed his security team to handle the matter quietly, concerned about potential negative publicity for the building. The residents were told only that Richard had been terminated for policy violations and a new building manager was appointed. Jamal thanked Maxwell for believing him enough to investigate thoroughly, but the incident left him still viewed with suspicion by many staff members who had heard the accusations but not the resolution. Later that evening, when Maxwell visited Catherine to share the events of the day, she listened thoughtfully before responding. "You did the right thing by finding the truth, Maxwell, but why keep it quiet? By not clearing Jamal's name publicly, you've protected your building's reputation at the expense of his." Her words lingered with Maxwell long after he left, raising uncomfortable questions about whose comfort and reputation he instinctively prioritized and why. 2 weeks later, Catherine's 75th birthday arrived. Maxwell had arranged an elegant celebration at his estate in the Hamptons, inviting the carefully curated circle of business associates, board members, and social connections that constituted his world. Catherine, however, had her own ideas. "I've invited Jamal to join us," she informed Maxwell the morning of the party. Maxwell nearly choked on his coffee. "You did what?" Catherine remained unruffled. "He's been a delightful companion during my visits, and I wanted him there. The invitation has been extended, and he has accepted." Maxwell knew better than to argue with his mother once her mind was made, but anxiety gnawed at him throughout the day. That evening, as black luxury vehicles delivered guests wearing designer evening wear and fine jewelry to the waterfront mansion, Jamal arrived by train and then taxi, dressed in what was clearly his best outfit, a new but inexpensive suit that indicated he had spent his first paycheck attempting to fit into this world that was not his own. Maxwell greeted him with strained politeness, hyper-aware of the curious and sometimes disapproving glances from his guests. Catherine, however, beamed upon seeing him, introducing him to everyone as the wonderful young man who saved my life, a framing that made it difficult for even the most elite guests to dismiss him entirely. The cocktail hour passed in a blur of awkward introductions and tense smiles until dinner was served in the grand dining room overlooking the Atlantic. Maxwell had seated Jamal between Catherine and an elderly board member with poor hearing, hoping to minimize uncomfortable interactions. He had not accounted for Harrison Phillips, who arrived late and clearly displeased to discover Jamal's presence. Throughout the meal, Harrison made pointed remarks just loud enough to be heard about standards slipping and security concerns. Catherine expertly deflected these comments while engaging Jamal in conversation about his interests and experiences at the Monroe Building. As dessert was being served, the conversation turned to Maxwell's latest project, a new clean energy storage solution that had hit technical difficulties. Several investors were present, including Thomas Whitford, whose potential 8-figure investment was crucial to the project's continuation. The problem is efficiency loss during the transfer phase, Maxwell explained, as the technically inclined guests leaned in with interest. Our engineers haven't found a viable solution that doesn't compromise the system's integrity. To everyone's surprise, Jamal spoke up. Have you considered a modular approach with redundant transfer circuits? It would allow for selective shutdown without compromising the whole system. The table fell silent. Maxwell stared at Jamal, wondering how he could possibly know enough about the project to make such a specific suggestion. Thomas Whitford turned to Jamal with genuine interest. That's precisely the kind of thinking that disrupts traditional approaches. How did you come to that conclusion, young man? Jamal explained that during his maintenance rounds, he often paused in the lobby to read the technical journals left in the reception area, many featuring articles about Grant Technologies projects. I've always been interested in sustainable energy solutions, he added. Before the fire, I was working on a small-scale solar storage system for my neighborhood. Whitford was clearly impressed, asking Jamal several follow-up questions that the young man answered with surprising technical insight. Maxwell watched with a mixture of amazement and discomfort as Jamal and Whitford engaged in an increasingly animated discussion, drawing in other guests who seemed to forget their initial reservations about the maintenance worker in their midst. Harrison, however, grew visibly agitated. As coffee was served, he rose to refill his drink and deliberately bumped into Jamal's chair, causing a full glass of red wine to spill across Jamal's lap and shirt. "How clumsy of me," Harrison said with mock concern that fooled no one. But then, not everyone belongs in settings like this. The room fell silent at the obvious slight. Jamal quietly accepted napkins from a server and began dabbing at the stain, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. Catherine rose from her seat, her voice cutting through the awkward silence. "Harrison Phillips, I have known you for 20 years, and never have I been more disappointed in your behavior. You will apologize to my guest immediately." Harrison's face flushed red. "Catherine, with all due respect, I think you're being taken in by an act. We know nothing about this boy's background or intentions." Catherine's eyes flashed dangerously. "I know that when I was alone and vulnerable, this young man helped me without hesitation or expectation. I know that despite being given the most demeaning tasks and treated with suspicion, he has worked harder than anyone at the Monroe Building. And I know that the only person displaying poor character in this room is standing before me now." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unused to witnessing such direct confrontation in their social circle. Maxwell stood frozen, torn between his loyalty to Harrison, his oldest friend and business partner, and his growing respect for Jamal and devotion to his mother. The moment was broken when Thomas Whitford stood and offered his own handkerchief to Jamal. "Young man, why don't you accompany me to find something to help with that stain? I'm quite interested in hearing more about your ideas on energy storage." As Whitford led Jamal from the room, the atmosphere remained tense. Maxwell attempted to salvage the evening, directing the conversation towards safer topics, but the damage was done. Later, as guests departed, Whitford pulled Maxwell aside. "Interesting young man, that Jamal. Reminds me of myself at his age, completely out of place in high society, but full of ideas that could change the world." Maxwell nodded noncommittally, but Whitford continued. "I came tonight prepared to finalize our investment discussion, but I find myself reconsidering." Maxwell's heart sank. "Because of the technical challenges?" Whitford shook his head slowly. "Because of what I witnessed tonight. The way your company treats someone with obvious talent and character reveals more about your corporate culture than any presentation ever could. I'm not convinced Grant Technologies is the forward-thinking organization I want to partner with." He handed Maxwell his card. "Call me when you've had some time to reflect on the kind of company you're really building." As Whitford's car pulled away, Maxwell stood in the driveway, the cool night air doing nothing to ease the burning realization that Harrison's behavior had potentially cost them an 8-figure investment, while the homeless teen he had reluctantly helped was the one person who had impressed their most important potential investor. The Monday following Catherine's birthday party, Maxwell found himself unable to focus on the quarterly projections displayed on his office screen. The weekend's events had shaken his perception of both Harrison and Jamal in ways he couldn't ignore. Opening his laptop, Maxwell began searching for information about Jamal Robinson that went beyond the basic background check security had performed when he was hired. Within hours, Maxwell discovered something that made him sit back in his chair, stunned. 3 years earlier, Jamal had won the National Youth Engineering Competition with a project focused on renewable energy storage, a smaller version of the very technology Grant Technologies was now struggling to perfect. Further searching revealed Jamal had been offered a full scholarship to MIT, contingent on completing his high school education. What had happened? Maxwell dug deeper, finding a small news article about an incident 18 months ago. Jamal had been arrested at a protest in downtown Manhattan, charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. The charges were later dropped when video evidence showed Jamal had simply been walking past the protest on his way home from his after-school job when police began making arrests. Despite the charges being dismissed, the prestigious scholarship had been rescinded, with the university citing character concerns in their withdrawal letter. Maxwell sat back, troubled by the implications. A single incident, based on nothing more than Jamal being in the wrong place with the wrong skin color, had derailed what should have been a bright future. The thought was interrupted by his assistant, announcing Catherine had arrived. Maxwell found his mother looking more tired than usual, settling carefully into the chair across from his desk. "I need to discuss something important with you," she said, her voice serious. "My doctor has concerns about some recent test results. Nothing definitive yet, but enough to make me think about what matters most." Maxwell began to protest, to insist on specialist consultations and second opinions, but Catherine raised her hand to stop him. "What I want to discuss is Jamal." Maxwell sat back, surprised. "Jamal? What about him?" Catherine leaned forward. "Promise me you'll help him, Maxwell. Not just with a maintenance job and a place to stay, but with achieving his potential. That boy has a brilliant mind and a good heart, both going to waste because of circumstances beyond his control." Maxwell thought of the scholarship information he'd just uncovered. "I'm not sure what you're asking me to do, Mother." Catherine's eyes held his steadily. "I'm asking you to see him, Maxwell. Really see him, the way you would if he looked like you or came from your world. Give him the opportunity he deserves based on his abilities, not limited by your or Harrison's preconceptions." She reached across the desk to take her son's hand. "Promise me." Unable to refuse, especially given her health concerns, Maxwell promised. The next day, without consulting Harrison, Maxwell offered Jamal a position in the company's summer internship program, traditionally reserved for Ivy League students with family connections. The human resources director raised eyebrows but complied with the CEO's directive. Jamal accepted with grateful surprise, his eyes lighting up at the opportunity to work with the technology he had studied independently for years. His first day in the corporate headquarters revealed a very different world from the service corridors of the Monroe Building. The sleek offices of Grant Technologies occupied 30 floors of a midtown skyscraper, with security checkpoints, executive dining rooms, and teams of brilliant engineers working on cutting-edge technology. Jamal was assigned to the Energy Storage Division, the very project discussed at Catherine's birthday party. From the start, he faced subtle and not so subtle resistance. Team members assumed he was there only because of Catherine's intervention, a charity case rather than a qualified contributor. His ideas were overlooked in meetings, his questions treated as interruptions rather than valid inquiries. Harrison, still smarting from the birthday party confrontation, deliberately assigned him to document organization and coffee runs, despite his technical qualifications. Maxwell observed this treatment from a distance, uncomfortable but uncertain how to intervene without confirming the suspicion that Jamal was receiving special treatment. 3 weeks into the internship, the energy storage project hit another major setback when the prototype failed during a critical test. The team worked overtime trying to identify the problem, with senior engineers poring over technical specifications and test results. Late one evening, Maxwell found Jamal alone in the lab, examining the failed prototype with careful attention. "Everyone else has gone home," Maxwell observed. Jamal looked up, surprised to see the CEO. "I wanted to understand what went wrong," he explained. "I think I might have found something." He hesitated, clearly unsure whether his insight would be welcomed. Maxwell gestured for him to continue. Jamal pointed to a specific component. "The thermal regulation system is creating microfractures in the transfer medium during temperature fluctuations. It's too rigid to accommodate the expansion and contraction." He pulled up a modified design on his tablet. "If we use a flexible composite here instead, with these adaptive connection points, it should solve the problem." Maxwell studied the design, immediately recognizing its potential. "Have you shown this to the team lead?" Jamal nodded. "I tried, but Dr. Michaels said they had already explored all viable alternatives." The next morning, Maxwell called a team meeting and asked Jamal to present his solution. The room's skepticism was palpable until Maxwell endorsed the concept and ordered a prototype built to Jamal's specifications. 1 week later, the modified prototype passed all preliminary tests, functioning exactly as Jamal had predicted. The breakthrough would potentially save months of development time and millions in research costs. Maxwell expected Harrison to be pleased, despite his personal feelings about Jamal. Instead, he found his partner unusually quiet during the success report. Later that day, Maxwell discovered why. Reviewing the presentation materials for an upcoming investor meeting, he noticed Jamal's contribution had been entirely omitted. The breakthrough was attributed to the senior engineering team's persistent innovation, with no mention of the intern whose design had solved the problem. Confronting Harrison in private, Maxwell demanded an explanation. Harrison didn't even attempt to hide his actions. "You can't seriously expect me to tell our investors that our multi-million-dollar technical problem was solved by some homeless kid we found on the street. It would undermine confidence in our entire engineering division." Maxwell pointed out that the solution was what mattered, regardless of its source. Harrison laughed. "That's because you're focused on the technology, Maxwell. I'm focused on the company. Our brand is built on elite expertise and exclusive talent. We start promoting diversity, hire success stories, and next thing you know, we're losing our edge to become a social justice project." The phrase, "diversity hire," hung in the air between them, forcing Maxwell to confront the ugly truth that Harrison viewed Jamal not as a talented individual, but as a demographic token, a categorization that apparently justified dismissing his contributions regardless of their merit. For the first time, Maxwell began to see his oldest friend and business partner through new eyes, wondering how many other talented individuals had been sidelined over the years based on Harrison's prejudices, and how complicit his own silence had made him in perpetuating this system. Over the next 2 weeks, Jamal continued to excel, despite the obstacles placed in his way. His redesigned component became the cornerstone of the revised energy storage system, and even team members who had initially dismissed him began seeking his input on technical challenges. Maxwell found himself paying closer attention to the dynamics within the company, noticing patterns of exclusion he had previously overlooked. Harrison, meanwhile, grew increasingly determined to undermine Jamal's position. During a private executive lunch, Maxwell overheard Harrison instructing the Human Resources Director to implement more stringent background checks for all interns and entry-level positions. "We need to maintain certain standards," Harrison emphasized. "Criminal records of any kind should be automatic disqualification." The timing made Harrison's target obvious. He was attempting to create company policy that would retroactively disqualify Jamal, despite the charges against him having been dismissed. Maxwell was still considering how to address this when his assistant interrupted with an urgent message. Catherine had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing at home. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of hospital corridors, urgent consultations with specialists, and the gut-wrenching diagnosis Catherine had suffered a severe stroke. She lay unresponsive in intensive care, machines monitoring her vital signs as doctors delivered cautious prognoses. Maxwell barely left her side, all business concerns forgotten in the face of potentially losing his only remaining parent. Harrison managed the company in his absence, sending appropriate flower arrangements and visiting the hospital briefly but clearly uncomfortable in the setting of illness and mortality. On the fourth day, as Catherine remained in a coma, Maxwell finally checked his corporate email, finding hundreds of messages requiring attention. Buried among them was a company-wide announcement of a strategic restructuring implemented by Harrison as acting CEO. The memo detailed elimination of several positions deemed non-essential to core operations, including all current internship positions. Jamal's position had been terminated, effective immediately. According to the building security logs, he had already cleared out his workspace and returned his access badge. Furious, Maxwell called Harrison, who defended the decision as a necessary cost-cutting measure during uncertain times. "We had to make quick decisions while you were unavailable," Harrison explained, his tone reasonable. The board approved temporary executive authority given the circumstances. When Maxwell pointed out that only Jamal's internship had been eliminated while other interns remained, Harrison's voice cooled. "The others are continuing their family-sponsored university education. They have concrete futures with potential value to the company. Your charity case was a resource drain with no clear ROI." Maxwell hung up without responding, too overwhelmed with his mother's condition to fight this battle immediately. 2 more days passed before Catherine showed signs of regaining consciousness. When she finally opened her eyes, her speech was slurred but comprehensible. Her first question stunned Maxwell. "Where is Jamal?" she asked, looking around the hospital room as if expecting to find him there. Maxwell hesitated, unsure how to respond without upsetting her fragile condition. "He's not here right now, Mother." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly, her perception still sharp despite her physical weakness. "What happened?" Reluctantly, Maxwell explained that Jamal was no longer with the company, trying to minimize Harrison's role in the decision. Catherine struggled to sit up, her voice stronger with emotion. "You promised me, Maxwell." Maxwell took her hand, trying to calm her. "Mother, please don't agitate yourself. We can discuss Jamal later when you're stronger." Catherine's grip tightened on his hand with surprising strength. "No, now. You need to know something." She paused, gathering her limited strength. "I changed my will last month. Jamal is in it." Maxwell stared at her in shock. "You what? Mother, you barely know him." Catherine's eyes held his steadily. "I know enough. I see in him what I once saw in you, before money and power became your only measures of worth. He will use whatever I leave him to build something meaningful, not just profitable." The revelation left Maxwell speechless, confronting not only his mother's decision, but her assessment of what he had become. As he sat by her bedside that night, watching her sleep, Maxwell was forced to examine how far he had drifted from the values she and his father had instilled in him, and how completely he had failed to recognize the prejudice embedded in the company culture he had built or the promises he had broken to the person who mattered most to him. After stabilizing for several days, Catherine was moved from intensive care to a private room for continued recovery and rehabilitation. Maxwell arranged for the best specialists and round-the-clock private nursing care, but split his time between the hospital and returning to work, where the fallout from Harrison's actions awaited. His first priority was locating Jamal. Security records showed he had left without protest, simply packing his few belongings from his desk and the studio apartment at the Monroe Building. Maxwell hired a private investigator who located Jamal within 48 hours. He was staying at a youth shelter in Queens and had already found 2 minimum-wage jobs, one at a convenience store overnight and another at an auto repair shop during the day. Maxwell drove to the repair shop himself, finding Jamal underneath a car, covered in grease and sweat. The young man's surprise at seeing the billionaire CEO standing in the garage quickly shifted to wariness. "Mr. Grant, did you need something?" The formality hurt more than Maxwell expected. He suggested they talk somewhere more private, and they walked to a nearby park. Sitting on a bench overlooking a small pond, Maxwell came directly to the point. "I want you to come back to Grant Technologies. Your position is still open, and I'm prepared to offer you a promotion to junior engineer with appropriate salary and benefits." Jamal was silent for a long moment, studying the water. "Why?" he finally asked. "Because you deserve it," Maxwell replied. "Your solution to the energy transfer problem was brilliant. The prototype is testing successfully, and the project is moving forward because of your contribution." Jamal shook his head slightly. "That's not what I meant. Why now? You were there when I was sidelined in meetings. You saw how my ideas were dismissed until you validated them. You knew about my background and capabilities, but still let me scrub toilets for weeks. So why the sudden change of heart?" The directness of the question caught Maxwell off guard. "I made a promise to my mother," he admitted. Jamal nodded, as if this confirmed something. "How is Mrs. Grant?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Recovering slowly. She asked about you." Another silence fell between them before Jamal spoke again. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Grant, I really do. But I can't come back." Maxwell was genuinely surprised. "Why not?" "This is an opportunity most people would jump at." Jamal turned to face him directly. "Because nothing has changed. Mr. Phillips still runs day-to-day operations. The same people who barely acknowledged my existence still fill the executive offices. I'd still be seen as the charity case who got special treatment because of your mother." His voice remained respectful but firm. "I spent every day there trying to prove my worth, working twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. It was exhausting and ultimately pointless, because no matter what I contributed, the credit went elsewhere. I'd rather work honest jobs where at least the rules are clear than return to a place where the game is rigged no matter how well I play." The brutal honesty of Jamal's assessment forced Maxwell to confront the reality of his company culture in a way he had previously avoided. He had always prided himself on running a meritocracy where the best ideas won, but Jamal's experience revealed a very different truth. Maxwell returned to his office troubled by the conversation, seeing his company through new eyes. He began paying closer attention to hiring patterns, promotion histories, and team compositions. The evidence was clear once he looked for it. Grant Technologies had a serious diversity problem, particularly in technical and leadership roles. The few employees of color were concentrated in support functions, and none had advanced beyond middle management despite years of service. Meanwhile, Harrison had been busy during Maxwell's preoccupation with Catherine's health. Learning of Maxwell's meeting with Jamal, he had begun quietly turning board members against Maxwell, suggesting his judgment was compromised by emotional distress over his mother's condition. "Maxwell has always been the technical genius," Harrison told them in private calls and lunches, "but his strengths don't include people management or strategic business decisions. That's why our partnership works. I handle those areas while he focuses on innovation." But lately, his priorities seemed to have shifted. The insinuation was clear. Maxwell was no longer reliably focused on company success. The situation came to a head when a major technical glitch was discovered in the flagship product just days before launch. The failure was traced to a recent code change that hadn't been properly vetted, costing millions in emergency fixes and delayed release. Harrison publicly blamed the oversight on disruptions to our established processes and experimental staffing decisions, clear references to Jamal's brief tenure, and Maxwell's recent focus on diversity issues. When the stock price dropped 8% in response to the launch delay, several board members began questioning Maxwell's leadership more openly. Maxwell suspected something wasn't right about the timing and nature of the technical failure. He quietly asked the head of cybersecurity to conduct a forensic investigation of all system access during the relevant period. 3 days later, he had his answer. The problematic code had been inserted during a late-night access from Harrison's private terminal, using his authentication credentials. Further investigation revealed a pattern: the information Harrison had leaked to competitors, the emails he had deleted from Maxwell's account during his absence, the selective communications he had shared with board members. The evidence pointed to a calculated campaign to undermine Maxwell and gain control of the company. But the cyber investigation uncovered something even more disturbing: years of discriminatory hiring practices implemented under Harrison's direction without Maxwell's knowledge or approval. Qualified applicants, with names suggesting minority backgrounds, had been systematically filtered out of consideration for technical and leadership roles. Interview feedback for candidates of color consistently included vague concerns about cultural fit, regardless of their qualifications. Maxwell sat alone in his office late into the night, reviewing the evidence with growing horror. The company he had built, that bore his family name, had been operating on principles fundamentally opposed to the values his parents had taught him. And he had enabled it through his indifference, his willingness to focus on technology while leaving people issues to Harrison. The realization was as painful as it was undeniable. His hands were far from clean in this situation. The discrimination hadn't happened despite him, but because of his silence and inattention. And now, as he prepared to confront Harrison, he faced the terrible possibility of losing not just his oldest friend, but the company he had spent his life building. The confrontation with Harrison took place in Maxwell's office early the next morning, before other executives arrived. Maxwell laid out the evidence of sabotage and discrimination calmly, watching Harrison's expressions shift from denial to defensive anger. "So, I protected our brand and maintained our standards," Harrison finally said, dropping all pretense. "That's what made this company successful, not coddling every diversity hire with a sob story." Maxwell pushed the cybersecurity report across the desk. "You deliberately undermined a major product launch to damage my credibility with the board. That's not protecting the company, that's corporate sabotage." Harrison leaned forward. "I did what was necessary when you lost your way. Your mother gets saved by some random street kid, and suddenly you're ready to throw away everything we built on some guilt-driven social justice crusade." He straightened his tie with practiced confidence. "But this conversation is moot. I've already secured the support of enough board members to call for a vote of no confidence at tomorrow's emergency meeting." His smile was cold. "You have a choice, Maxwell. Step down quietly with your reputation and considerable wealth intact, or fight a public battle that will expose how this company has really operated for years. Either way, your days as CEO are over." After Harrison left, Maxwell sat motionless, the weight of the decision before him crushing. That afternoon he visited Catherine, whose condition had improved enough for longer conversations. She listened without interruption as he explained the situation, then took his hand in hers. "What does your heart tell you to do, Maxwell?" she asked simply. Maxwell sighed. "Business sense says to take the quiet exit. The company's value would plummet if this became public. Thousands of employees would be affected. My entire legacy would be tainted." Catherine's eyes held his steadily. "And what about your legacy as a human being? What will that be if you choose silence and comfort over truth and justice again?" Her words cut straight to his core. "What would Dad have done?" he asked quietly. "Your father would have done the right thing, regardless of the cost," Catherine answered without hesitation. "He built his first company on the principle that character matters more than profit. That's the legacy he wanted for you." That evening, Maxwell made a call he never expected to make. He contacted Jamal, asking to meet again, this time at his penthouse. When Jamal arrived, clearly puzzled by the invitation, Maxwell explained the situation frankly, holding nothing back about Harrison's actions or his own complicity through inaction. "I'm going to fight," he concluded. "But I need your help. You experienced the discrimination in our company firsthand. Your testimony could be crucial in exposing what's been happening." Jamal considered this carefully. "You realize you're asking me to publicly challenge one of the most powerful companies in the tech industry. That could make me unemployable in this field forever." Maxwell acknowledged the risk. "Yes, and I wouldn't ask if there were any other way, but Harrison has spent years covering his tracks. Without first-hand accounts from people who experienced the discrimination, it becomes his word against mine with the board." Jamal was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Grant believed in me when no one else did. She saw something in me worth fighting for." He looked up, decision made. "I'll help, not for you, but for her." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Maxwell's legal team worked through the night documenting evidence and preparing statements. Just before the board meeting was set to begin, Harrison made one last attempt to sway Maxwell. "This is business, not personal," he insisted. "Take the graceful exit. We both know the company will suffer if this gets ugly." Maxwell met his gaze steadily. "You made it personal the moment you decided some people were worth less than others based on the color of their skin. I can't walk away from that." The board meeting began with Harrison confidently presenting his case for Maxwell's removal, citing the recent product launch failure and questionable personnel decisions. When Maxwell's turn came, he didn't defend himself as expected. Instead, he presented the evidence of Harrison's sabotage, followed by documentation of the discriminatory hiring practices. The bombshell came when Jamal entered the room, along with 5 former employees of color who had faced similar discrimination. One by one, they told their stories, painting a devastating picture of systematic exclusion and prejudice. Harrison attempted to discredit their testimonies, dismissing them as disgruntled former employees seeking revenge or compensation. The strategy might have worked with the board previously, but the detailed evidence and consistent patterns were too compelling to ignore. The meeting adjourned, with the board promising a full investigation before any leadership decisions. Outside the boardroom, Harrison approached Maxwell, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea what you've started. I've recorded every conversation we've had about hiring and policy for years, edited appropriately. They'll show you were fully aware and supportive of every decision made." He smiled thinly. "I've already had my team prepare the releases. By this time tomorrow, you'll be painted as the architect of discrimination who's trying to use me as a scapegoat now that it's convenient." The threat wasn't idle. The next morning, carefully edited audio clips began circulating online, purportedly showing Maxwell endorsing discriminatory hiring practices and dismissing diversity concerns. Out of context and selectively edited, the clips painted a damning picture. Business news outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded with calls for boycotts of Grant Technologies products. Maxwell watched as the carefully constructed reputation he had built over decades began to crumble in real time. The choice before him was stark and painful: release all company communications from the past decade to prove the audio was misleading, thereby exposing his own complicity through inaction, or fight a losing battle against Harrison's manipulated narrative. After a sleepless night, Maxwell made his decision. He would release everything, regardless of how it reflected on him. The truth mattered more than his reputation. As he prepared to make the announcement, his assistant interrupted with urgent news Catherine had taken a turn for the worse. Maxwell rushed to the hospital to find Catherine conscious but significantly weakened. The doctors explained the stress of her condition had caused complications, and they were concerned about her heart. "You need to rest, Mother," Maxwell insisted, sitting beside her bed. Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper, but determined. "Tell me what's happening with Harrison." Unable to deny her, Maxwell explained the situation with the edited recordings and his decision to release all communications. Catherine listened intently, then asked for her tablet. "I need to show you something." She navigated to a private email account Maxwell had never seen before, accessing a folder labeled Insurance. Inside were dozens of recordings Catherine herself had made of conversations with Harrison and other executives over the years, many taking place in her home during social gatherings or in supposedly private moments when they didn't realize she was listening. "I've watched Harrison manipulate you for years," she explained. "After your father died, I saw how he gradually changed the company culture, always careful to keep you focused on the technology while he handled the people issues. I started keeping records when I realized what was happening." The recordings were damning, showing Harrison explicitly discussing strategies to maintain the company's cultural homogeneity while keeping Maxwell insulated from hiring decisions. In one particularly shocking clip, Harrison laughed with another executive about how they had created a system where Maxwell gets to play the colorblind meritocracy champion while we make sure the right people get through the door. Maxwell listened with growing horror to conversations that had happened in his own home, at events he had attended, revealing a systematic deception he had been blind to for years. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, hurt by the revelation that his mother had known, and said nothing. Catherine's eyes were sad but resolute. "Would you have believed me over Harrison? He was your best friend, your trusted partner. You would have dismissed my concerns as an old woman's paranoia." The truth of her words stung. "When I met Jamal," Catherine continued, "I saw an opportunity to finally open your eyes. That's why I insisted you help him, not just for his sake, but for yours." The realization of his mother's foresight and patience humbled Maxwell. "These recordings could save the company, Mother." Catherine shook her head slightly. "That's not why I kept them. I kept them in case you ever found the courage to stand up for what's right, so you wouldn't stand alone." She gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Use them if you must, but remember that saving the company isn't the goal. Creating a company worthy of being saved is what matters." That evening, as Maxwell prepared to release both Catherine's recordings and the full company communications, his phone rang with news that Catherine had suffered a cardiac event. By the time he reached the hospital, she was unconscious, her condition critical. For the next 36 hours, Maxwell remained by her side. Corporate battles momentarily forgotten as he faced the prospect of losing her. During a brief moment, when he left to shower and change, Catherine regained consciousness long enough to make a final request of her private nurse. She dictated a brief message and asked that it be recorded on video. When Maxwell returned, the nurse pulled him aside to show him the recording. Catherine, frail but clear-eyed, stared directly into the camera. "I, Catherine Elizabeth Grant, am of sound mind despite my physical condition. I wish to make a statement regarding the current situation at Grant Technologies." She detailed conversations she had witnessed between Harrison Phillips and other executives, describing their deliberate efforts to maintain a racially homogeneous corporate culture while keeping her son focused on technical innovations rather than human resources. She named dates, locations, and witnesses to these conversations with remarkable clarity. "My son's failure was in trusting too completely and delegating too broadly, not in creating or endorsing discrimination. The company culture was deliberately shaped without his full knowledge, though his inattention enabled it." She paused, gathering strength for her final words. "I make this statement now because justice matters more than comfort, and truth matters more than legacy. This is the lesson I hope my son finally learns, even at great cost." The video ended with Catherine looking directly into the camera with the fierce dignity that had always defined her. The nurse informed Maxwell that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 hours after recording the message, having used the last of her strength to protect her son while still holding him accountable. Grief-stricken but determined to honor his mother's final act, Maxwell released both the complete company communications and Catherine's recordings and testimony. The resulting media storm was immediate and intense. Harrison appeared on financial news programs portraying himself as a whistleblower who had been trying to reform discriminatory practices from within, but Catherine's testimony and the unedited communications undermined his credibility. Former employees came forward with additional stories, creating a comprehensive picture of a company culture built on exclusion and bias. Public opinion, initially turned against Maxwell by Harrison's selective leaks, began to shift as the full story emerged. Grant Technologies' stock plummeted as investors worried about potential discrimination lawsuits and damage to the brand. Through it all, Maxwell remained largely secluded, mourning his mother and preparing for her funeral. The service, held at the small church Catherine had attended throughout her life, drew hundreds of mourners, including many current and former employees. To Maxwell's surprise, Jamal attended, standing quietly at the back until Maxwell approached him. "She believed in me when no one else did," Jamal said simply. "I needed to say goodbye." The moment of connection between them was interrupted by Maxwell's phone, buzzing with news that the board had called an emergency session to determine leadership going forward. Despite his grief, Maxwell knew he needed to be present for this critical decision. The boardroom atmosphere was tense as Maxwell entered. The directors, many of whom had been prepared to vote him out just days earlier, now faced a public relations nightmare and potential legal liability. After 4 hours of heated discussion, a compromise was reached. Both Maxwell and Harrison would step down temporarily while an independent investigation was conducted. In the interim, the company would be led by a trusted senior executive with a mandate to implement immediate reforms to address the discriminatory practices exposed in the communications. As Maxwell left the boardroom, possibly for the last time, he felt a strange sense of peace despite the uncertain future. His mother's final lesson had been delivered at great cost, but he was finally beginning to understand what she had tried to teach him throughout her life, that integrity mattered more than success, and that remaining silent in the face of injustice made one complicit regardless of intentions. Walking through the headquarters he had built, Maxwell saw it with new clarity, the subtle patterns of exclusion in who occupied which roles, the homogeneity of the executive floor, the talented individuals who had been relegated to support positions despite their capabilities. He had built a technology empire while remaining blind to the human cost of how it operated. As he reached the lobby, he found Jamal waiting. "I heard about the board decision," Jamal said. "What will you do now?" Maxwell considered the question that had been occupying his thoughts since Catherine's death. "I'm not sure yet, but whatever it is, I want to get it right this time." 3 months after Catherine's funeral, Maxwell Grant stood at a podium in the company's main auditorium, facing employees, media, and board members. The independent investigation had confirmed what Catherine's recordings and company communications had already revealed: systematic discrimination throughout Grant Technologies, implemented primarily by Harrison, but enabled by corporate structures and leadership inattention. Harrison had resigned in disgrace, facing potential legal action from former employees. The board had asked Maxwell to return as CEO, citing his technical vision and commitment to reform, but he had declined. Instead, he was here today to announce his next steps. "For 30 years, I've prided myself on building technology that changes how the world works," Maxwell began. "But I failed to notice or address how my own company worked. That blindness was not accidental. It was a choice to focus on what I found comfortable and delegate what I found challenging." He paused, looking out at the assembled faces. "My mother's final lesson to me was that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, regardless of intent. It's a lesson I should have learned much earlier." Maxwell announced his decision to sell his controlling shares in Grant Technologies and step down permanently as CEO. The billions from the sale would establish the Catherine Grant Foundation, dedicated to creating educational and professional opportunities for underrepresented minorities in STEM fields. The foundation's first initiative will be a full scholarship program for promising students facing barriers to education, Maxwell explained. "And I'm pleased to announce that the first recipient of this opportunity is someone who exemplifies exactly the kind of talent our industry has been missing." Jamal joined Maxwell on stage, visibly moved by the moment. Jamal Robinson will receive full funding for his education at MIT, which has reinstated his acceptance in light of recent events. Upon completion of his degree, he will join the Foundation's leadership team, helping to identify and support other deserving students. The announcement was met with applause, particularly from younger employees who had been pushing for change within the company. Later that evening, as Maxwell packed personal items from his office for the last time, His assistant delivered a sealed envelope that had been held by Catherine's attorney with instructions to deliver it 100 days after her death. Inside, Maxwell found a handwritten letter in his mother's elegant script. "My dearest son," it began, "if you're reading this, I've succeeded in my final mission to open your eyes to what truly matters. I've fought a quiet battle for years against the prejudice Harrison brought into our company, funding programs you never knew about and supporting people pushed aside by his policies." Maxwell sat heavily in his chair, stunned by this revelation. The letter continued, detailing Catherine's behind-the-scenes efforts to counter discrimination within Grant Technologies without directly confronting her son, a network of support and mentorship she had created for employees who faced barriers within the company. "I never told you because you needed to recognize the problem yourself," she wrote. "Change imposed from outside never lasts. It must come from within, from true understanding and conviction." The final paragraphs brought tears to Maxwell's eyes. "I knew from the moment I met Jamal that he was the key to your awakening. There are no accidents in life, Maxwell. His presence in our lives was the catalyst you needed, which is why I arranged for him to be there that day." Maxwell stared at the words in disbelief. His mother had orchestrated the meeting that changed everything? The letter concluded, "Jamal didn't know about my plan, but I had been supporting his community center for years before the fire that took his family. I knew of his brilliance and character long before you did. His father worked for Grant Technologies in the early days, before Harrison's influence pushed him out. The cycle of injustice that began with his father may now be broken with his son. If you have the courage to complete what I've begun, I love you, my son. Make me proud not by what you build, but by who you become." Maxwell sat alone in his office as night fell over the city, the letter in his hands illuminated by the desk lamp. Everything he thought he knew about the past months had been upended by his mother's final revelation. Catherine hadn't just been a concerned observer, she had been orchestrating a profound lesson in justice and responsibility, using her considerable intelligence and resources to create the circumstances for her son's moral awakening. The next morning, Maxwell met with Jamal at a small cafe away from corporate headquarters. After sharing Catherine's letter, he asked the question that had kept him awake all night. "Did you know about my mother's involvement in your life before we met?" Jamal shook his head, equally stunned by the revelation. "I knew she donated to the community center sometimes, but I had no idea she was tracking my progress or that she knew about my father's history with the company." He hesitated before continuing. "My dad never talked much about his time at Grant Technologies. He just said it wasn't the right environment for him to grow. Now I understand what he meant." Maxwell nodded slowly. "I failed your father without ever knowing him. And I almost failed you too." He looked out the cafe window at the city beyond. "My mother spent years creating a shadow network to support people like your father, people the company should have valued but didn't, all while I remained oblivious, focused on technology rather than humanity." Jamal considered this thoughtfully. "Mrs. Grant told me once that change happens in two ways, fast and slow. Fast change gets the headlines, but slow change builds the foundations. She said she was working on the foundation while waiting for someone to create the headline." He smiled slightly. "I guess that someone turned out to be both of us." In the months that followed, Maxwell worked closely with Jamal to establish the Catherine Grant Foundation. The scholarship program expanded rapidly, identifying promising students from underrepresented backgrounds and providing not just financial support but mentorship and professional opportunities. Grant Technologies, under new leadership committed to genuine reform, became a corporate partner, creating internship pathways for scholarship recipients. Maxwell declined invitations to return to the tech industry in any capacity, focusing instead on supporting the Foundation's mission. He sold his Hamptons estate and Manhattan penthouse, moving to a modest home where he could work without the distractions of extreme wealth. A year after Catherine's death, the Foundation hosted its first annual gala, honoring her legacy and introducing the inaugural class of scholarship recipients. As Maxwell stood at the podium preparing to address the attendees, he caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. An elderly man using a cane was being escorted to a front row seat by one of the Foundation staff. It took Maxwell a moment to recognize him as Harold Robinson, Jamal's grandfather, whom he had met briefly at Catherine's funeral. After the speeches, Maxwell made his way to Harold, who greeted him with surprising warmth. "Your mother was something special, Mr. Grant," Harold said, his voice strong despite his years. "She came to visit my son James after he left your company, told him she was sorry for what happened, and promised she was working to change things from the inside." Maxwell hadn't known this connection existed. "My father worked for your father first, back when the company was just starting," Harold continued. "Robert Grant was a good man who treated everyone with respect. Catherine wanted that spirit to return to the company you two built." He gestured toward Jamal, who was deep in conversation with several scholarship recipients. "My grandson is finally getting the chance his father should have had. The circle is complete now." As the evening concluded, Maxwell found himself standing with Jamal, overlooking the city skyline from the venue's terrace. "I found something interesting in the foundation paperwork yesterday," Jamal said. "Did you know your mother had been funding my education in secret since I was 10? Anonymous donations to my school for gifted student support that always seemed to cover what I needed." Maxwell shook his head, amazed once again by Catherine's foresight and quiet determination. She was playing a very long game. "Looking at the dates, she started supporting you around the same time Harrison began changing our hiring practices." Jamal nodded. "Your mother once told me that justice sometimes skips a generation but never disappears completely." I didn't understand what she meant then. He paused, looking out at the city lights. "I think she knew exactly what she was doing all along, bringing together the past and the future to heal something broken in the present." As they stood there, Maxwell realized that his mother's greatest legacy wasn't the foundation that bore her name, or even the opportunities it created. It was the lesson she had taught him through her final act of love, the understanding that true success isn't measured in wealth or power, but in the courage to recognize injustice and the commitment to address it, no matter the personal cost. The empire he had built had crumbled, but something more valuable had risen from its ruins: the redemption of his father's original vision and the fulfillment of his mother's long-held dream of a company where merit truly mattered more than privilege. What lessons do you take away from this story about racial discrimination and the power of quiet persistence in fighting injustice? Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination that went unchallenged because people in power were unwilling to see it? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, consider liking and subscribing to support more content that explores important social issues. Share this with someone who might need a reminder that change is possible, even in systems that seem unchangeable. Thank you for joining me for this journey through Maxwell and Jamal's story, and may we all find Catherine's courage to stand for what's right, even when it's difficult.